Renaissance, from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, http://www.wikipedia.org. In the traditional view, the Renaissance is understood as a historical age that was preceded by the Middle Ages and followed by the Reformation. The Italian Renaissance of the 15th century represented a reconnection of the West with classical antiquity, the absorption of knowledge, particularly mathematics, from Arabic, the return of experimentalism, the focus on the importance of living well in the present, e.g. Renaissance humanism, an explosion of the dissemination of knowledge brought on by printing, and the creation of new techniques in art, poetry, and architecture, leading in turn to a radical change in the style and substance of the arts and letters. This period represents Europe emerging from a long period as a backwater and the rise of commerce and exploration. The Italian Renaissance is often labeled as the beginning of the modern epoch. However, some present-day historians are skeptical about the accuracy of the above description, and critical or alternate views about this concept are discussed below. Historiography. The term rebirth, Renaissance, to indicate the flourishing of artistic and scientific activity starting in Italy in the mid-1300s, was first used by the Italian artist Giorgio Vasari in the Vitae, published in 1550. The term Renaissance is the French translation, used by French historian Jules Michelet and expanded upon by Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt, both in the 1860s. Rebirth is used in two ways. First, it means rediscovery of ancient classical texts and learning and their application in the arts and sciences. Second, it means that the results of these intellectual activities created revitalization of European culture in general. Thus, it is possible to speak of the Renaissance in two different but meaningful ways. A rebirth of classical learning and knowledge through the rediscovery of ancient texts, and also a rebirth of European culture in general. There were many amazing printers such as Raphael, Sanzio, and Michelangelo during this period. Multiple Renaissances. During the last quarter of the 20th century, many scholars took the view that the Italian Renaissance was perhaps only one of many such movements. This is in large part due to the work of historians like Charles H. Haskins, 1870 to 1937, who made a convincing case for a Renaissance of the 12th century, as well as by historians arguing for a Carolinian Renaissance. Both of these concepts are now widely accepted by the scholarly community at large. As a result, the present trend among historians is to discuss each so-called Renaissance in more particular terms, e.g. the Italian Renaissance, the English Renaissance, etc. This terminology is particularly useful because it eliminates the need for fitting the Renaissance into a chronology that previously held that it was preceded by the Middle Ages and followed by the Reformation, which many believe to be inaccurate. The entire period is now often replaced by the term early modern, see periodization, lumpers and splitters. Other periods of cultural rebirth have also been termed a Renaissance, such as the Harlem Renaissance or the San Francisco Renaissance. The other Renaissances are not considered further in this article, which will concentrate on the Renaissance as a transition from the Middle Ages to the modern age. Critical views. Since the term was first created in the 19th century, historians have had various interpretations on the Renaissance. Today, most historians view the Renaissance as a largely intellectual and ideological change rather than a substantive one. For example, Marxist historians view the Renaissance as a pseudo-revolution, with the changes in art, literature, and philosophy affecting only a very tiny minority of the very wealthy and powerful, while life for the great mass of the European population was unchanged from the Middle Ages. They thus deny that it is an event of much importance. Historians now point out that the negative social factors popularly associated with the medieval period, poverty, ignorance, warfare, religious and political persecution, and so forth, seem to have actually worsened during this age of Machiavelli, the wars of religion, the corrupt Borgia popes, and the intensified witch hunts of the 16th century. Many of the common people who lived during the Renaissance are known to have been concerned by the developments of the era, rather than viewing it as a golden age imagined by certain 19th century authors. Perhaps the most important factor of the Renaissance is that those involved in the cultural movements in questions, the artists, writers, and their patrons, believed they were living in a new era that was a clean break from the Middle Ages, even if much of the rest of the population seems to have viewed the period as an intensification of social maladies. Johann Huizinga, 1872 to 1945, acknowledged the existence of the Renaissance but questioned whether it was a positive change. He argued that the Renaissance was a period of decline from the High Middle Ages, which destroyed much that was important. The Latin language, for instance, had evolved greatly from the classical period, and was still used in the Church by others as a living language. However, the Renaissance obsession with classical purity saw Latin revert to its classical form, and its natural evolution halted. Meanwhile, George Sarton and Lynn Thorndike have both criticized how the Renaissance affected science, arguing that progress was slowed. Historians have begun to consider the word Renaissance as an unnecessarily loaded word that implies an unambiguously positive rebirth from the supposedly more primitive Middle Ages. Many historians now prefer using the term early modern for this period, a neutral term that highlights the period as a transitional one that led to the modern world but does not have any positive or negative connotations. Start of the Renaissance. The Renaissance has no set starting point or place. It happened gradually at different places in different times, and there are no defined dates or places for when the Middle Ages ended. The starting place of the Renaissance, however, is usually ascribed to central Italy, especially the city of Florence. One early Renaissance figure is the poet Dante Alighieri, 1265 to 1321, the first writer to embody the spirit of the Renaissance. Petrarch, 1304 to 1374, is another early Renaissance figure. As part of the humanist movement, he concluded that the height of human accomplishment had been reached in the Roman Empire, and the ages since had been a period of social rot which he labeled the Dark Ages. Petrarch saw history as social, art, and literary advancement, and not as a series of set religious events. Rebirth meant the rediscovery of ancient Roman and Greek Latin heritage through ancient manuscripts and the humanist method of learning. These new ideas from the past, called New Learning at the time, triggered the coming advancements in art, science, and other areas. Another possible starting point is the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. It was a turning point in warfare as cannon and gunpowder became a central element. In addition, Byzantine Greek scholars fled west to Rome, bringing renewed energy and interest in the Greek and Roman heritage, and it perhaps represented the end of the old religious order in Europe. Italian Renaissance. Main article, Italian Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance was intertwined with the intellectual movement known as Renaissance humanism, and with the fiercely independent and combative urban societies of the city-states of central and northern Italy in the 13th to 16th centuries. Florence, Italy, was the birthplace of the Renaissance for several reasons. The first 2 or 3 decades of the 15th century saw the emergence of a rare cultural efflorescence, particularly in Florence. This Florentine Enlightenment was a major achievement. It was a classical, classicizing culture which sought to live up to the republican ideals of Athens and Rome. Sculptors used Roman models and classical themes. This society had a new relationship with the classical past. It felt it owned this past and revived it. Florentines felt akin to 1st century BC Republican Rome. Rucellai wrote that he belonged to a great age. Leonardo Bruni's panegyric to the city of Florence expresses similar sentiments. There was a genuine appreciation for the plastic arts, pagan idols and statuary, with nudity and expressions of human dignity. Paintings took huge leaps forward in development, from the works of Giotto through Fra Angelico, Masaccio, Masolino, Piero della Francesca, and many others. A similar movement also occurred in the arts in early 15th century Florence, an avant-garde classicizing movement. Many of the same people were involved. Lorenzo Valla said that as they revived Latin, so was Latin architecture revived. For example, Rucellai's Palazzo, built by Leone Battista Alberti. Of Brunelleschi, he felt he was the greatest architect since Roman times. Sculpture was also revived, in many cases before the other arts. There was an obvious naturalism about contemporary sculpture, and highly true-to-life figures were being sculpted. Often biblically themed sculptures and paintings included recognizable Florentines. Mention should be made of the competition to sculpt bas-relief bronze panels for the baptistery in Florence. The winner of the competition was Ghiberti, whose naturalistically and elegantly expressive work won over Brunelleschi's entry. Brunelleschi went on to give up sculpture and became one of the world's most significant architects, designing the Duomo of Florence. The nascent philosophy of nominalism also played a part, and can be demonstrated by the attention to detail and the observation of nature expressed in many paintings of the time. Classicism was applied to both literature and art. In many city republics there was a small clique with the camaraderie and rivalry produced by a very small elite. Alberti felt that he had played a major part, as had Brunelleschi and Masaccio. The list of artists who contributed to the flowering of Italian art during this period is long and varied, and also includes Gentile di Fabriano, Fra Angelico, Lorenzo da Monaco, Fra Filippo Lippi, Masolino, Giovanni di Paolo, and many more. Alberti admitted that he had no explanation for why it happened. Causes. There are several possible explanations for the emergence of the Renaissance in Florence. The Medici did it. One of the oldest explanations is that the patronage of the Medici family allowed for the advancement of artwork, especially under Lorenzo. This in turn led to the Renaissance. Unfortunately, this explanation fails to fit chronologically. The start of the Renaissance can be dated to around 410 to 420 prior to the Medici's rise to power. The great man argument. This theory argues that Donatello, Brunelleschi, and Michelangelo were just geniuses. This is a circular argument which fails to explain the circumstances which allowed these three geniuses to come to fruition. The rise of individualism theory. This is a similar argument that argues for a change from collective neutrality towards the lonely genius. 14th and 15th century Italy. In 1300, Florence had a civic culture with people like Latini who had a sense of classical values, though different from the values of the 15th century. Villani also had a sense of the city as a daughter and creature of Rome. The 1380s saw several classicizing groups, including monks and citizens. There was a gradual build-up rather than a big bang. Apart from the elites, there was already an audience for the Renaissance. Florence was a very literate audience, already self-conscious and aware of its city and place in the political landscape. The crucial people of the 14th and 15th century were Manuel Chrysoloras, who increased interest in the grammar of ancient architecture, and Niccoli, a major influence on the perception of the classics. Their teachings reached the upper classes between 1410 and 1420, and it is argued that this is when the new consciousness emerged. Brucker noticed this new consciousness in council debates around 1410, as there were increased classical references. Florence experienced several crises at the turn of the 15th century, but the sense of crisis was over by 1415, and there was a new confidence, a triumphant experience of being a republic. Between the years 1413 to 1423, there was an economic boom. The upper class had the financial means to support scholarship. Gumbrich says there was a sense of ratifying oneself to the ancient world, leading to a snobbishness and an elite view of education, and a tendency for the rich to want to proclaim their ascendancy over the poor and over other cities. The early Renaissance was an act of collaboration. Artisans and artists were enmeshed in the networks of their city. Committees were usually responsible for buildings. There were collaborations between patricians and artisans without which the Renaissance could not have occurred. Thus one could argue for a civic theory of the Renaissance rather than a great man theory. The Renaissance spreads. Main article, Northern Renaissance. The Renaissance spread north out of Italy, being adapted and modified as it moved. It arrived in France, imported by King Charles VIII after his invasion of Italy. Francis I imported Italian arts and artists, including Leonardo da Vinci, and at great expense he built ornate palaces. Writers such as François Rabelais, Pierre de Ronsard, Joachim du Bellay, and Michel de Montaigne, painters such as Jean Clouet, and musicians such as Jean Mouton also borrowed from the spirit of the Italian Renaissance. Italians brought the new style to Poland and Hungary in the late 15th century. The first Italian humanist who came to Poland in the mid-15th century was Philip Callimachus. Many Italian artists came with Bona Sforza of Milano to Poland when she married Zygmunt I of Poland in 1518. The Polish Renaissance is the most Italian-like branch of the Renaissance outside of Italy. From France, the spirit of the age spread to the Low Countries and Germany, and finally to England, Scandinavia, and Central Europe by the late 16th century. In these areas, the Renaissance became closely linked to the turmoil of the Protestant Reformation, and the art and writing of the German Renaissance frequently reflected this dispute. While Renaissance ideas were moving north from Italy, there was a simultaneous spread southward of innovation, particularly in music. The music of the 15th century Burgundian school defined the beginning of the Renaissance in that art, and the philophony of the Netherlanders, as it moved with the musicians themselves into Italy, formed the core of what was the first true international style of music since the standardization of Gregorian chant in the 9th century. The culmination of the Netherlandish school was in the music of the Italian composer Palestrina. At the end of the 16th century, Italy again became a center of musical innovation, with the development of the polychoral style of the Venetian school, which spread northward into Germany around 1600. In England, the Elizabethan era marked the beginning of the English Renaissance. It saw writers such as William Shakespeare, Charles Marlowe, John Milton, and Edmund Spenser, as well as great artists and architects such as Inigo Jones, and composers such as Thomas Tallis, John Taverner, and William Byrd. Early Renaissance arrived in the Iberian Peninsula through the Mediterranean possessions of the Aragonese crown and the city of Valencia. Early Iberian Renaissance writers include Auxitius March, Joanot Martorell, Fernando de Rojas, Juan de Lencina, Garcilaso de la Vega, Gil Vicente, and Bernardín Ribero. Late Renaissance in Spain saw writers such as Miguel de Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Luis de Góngora, and Tirso de Molina, artists such as El Greco, and composers such as Tomás Luis de Victoria. In Portugal, writers such as Sá de Miranda and Luis de Camões and artists such as Nuno Gonçalves appeared. In these nations, the Renaissance would be built upon and supplanted by the thinkers of the Enlightenment in the 17th century. The paintings of the Italian Renaissance differed from those of the Northern Renaissance in some ways. The Italian Renaissance did not only focus on religious figures, but they also produced portraits of well-known figures of the day, and they also put religious figures in Greek or Roman backgrounds. During the Italian Renaissance, artists learned the rules of perspective, which show how far an object is by its size, and made the paintings look three-dimensional. The artists also used shading to make objects look round and real. The Italian Renaissance artists studied human anatomy and drew from the models so it would be possible for them to sketch the human body more accurately than before. At first, Northern Renaissance artists still focused on religious drawings, like Albrecht Dürer, who portrayed the religious upheaval of his age. Later on, Peter Bruegel's work influenced artists to paint scenes of daily life rather than religious or classical themes. During the Northern Renaissance, Van Eyck's also invented oil paint. With oil paint, artists could produce strong colors and a hard surface that would survive for centuries. These painters were called Flemish painters. This sound file and all text in the article are licensed under the GNU Free Documentation License, available at www.gnu.org/copyleft/fdl.html.